get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn these towns down. This was just one of the many hateful signs seen across California during the 1920s and the 1930s. But what if I told you that Filipinos have been in America long before the first Pilgrims even arrived? Our ancestors arrived on these shores centuries before the United States was even born. And not as mere sailors but as part of larger expeditions that connected two distant worlds. And this was no ordinary journey. In fact, they were part of something much bigger that shaped the course of world history. So who exactly were the first Filipinos in America and what brought them across the ocean? Mabuhay! Earn Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome to my channel, it's me Kirby Áraullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. Now before we dive in, today's video is actually an updated and expanded version of the one I made many years ago. In fact, today's topic was also the very first zine that I published under Project Bulosan, back when we were establishing the Bulosan Center for Filipino Studies at UC Davis. So let me know in the comments below if you would like to see an updated version of that zine. Anyways, in today's video, we're taking a deeper look into the very first Filipinos in America. But to understand this, we must first start with two questions. What do we mean by Filipino and what do we mean by America? So let's start with Filipino. Today, we think of Filipinos as people from the Philippines or those with roots in the Philippines. But that hasn't always been the case. Historically, the term Filipino used to refer only to the pure-blooded Spaniards born in the Philippines, while the diverse native peoples of the islands who made up the majority were referred to as Indios, and they identified themselves by their ethnicities or ethno-linguistic groups. And it was not until the late 1800s, during the rise of Filipino nationalism, that the term Filipino was reclaimed to include all the people of the archipelago, regardless of ethnicity or social class. But for simplicity and clarity, I'll use Filipino in this video to refer to the native peoples of what is now the Philippines, while also using specific ethnic names when necessary. Now, what do we mean by America? When we talk about America, we often think of the United States. But the reality is, America refers to two entire continents, North and South America, that have long been home to diverse peoples. In fact, indigenous peoples have lived on these lands for thousands of years, with rich cultures and deep histories long before their so-called discovery. So by broadening and deepening our understanding of America, we recognize that it includes much more than just the United States. And the history of Filipinos here is only one part of a broader narrative shaped by indigenous peoples and the many other diverse communities across these continents. Now let's begin with the very first recorded people from the Philippines to arrive in what would become the United States. On October 18, 1587, a group of Filipino sailors known as the Luzones Indios arrived at Morro Bay, California. They were part of a Spanish expedition under the command of Pedro de Unamuno aboard the galleon Nuestra Señora de la Esperanza. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Luzones Indios were not slaves fleeing captivity. They were expert navigators, sailors, and warriors, and the Spaniards relied heavily on their expertise to navigate the dangerous waters of the Pacific. They were natives of Luzon, the largest island of the Philippines, and while their exact names are lost to history, we can actually trace back where they came from. Colonial records from the Virreinato de Nueva España, or the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which included both Mexico and the Philippines, used shorter terms like Luzones or Luzones Indios to refer particularly to the Luzones Indios de la Pampanga, a vast colonial province that covered much of what is now Central Luzon. And this indicates that the Luzones Indios involved in these expeditions and those active in the early Manila Galleon trade and early California missions were Kapampangans, and early records recognized them for their maritime skills and martial prowess in Spain's Pacific and Asian expeditions. But while their skills were highly valued, the Luzones were also part of a system that exploited them. They were key players in Spain's colonial ventures, but they were also victims of the same system that sought to abuse their talents for Spain's imperial gains. There were at least 8 Luzon Indios aboard Unamuno's expedition, and though they relied heavily on their expertise, the Spaniards still viewed the lives of the Luzones Indios as expendable. Indeed, on October 18, 1587, it was the Luzones Indios who were sent ashore to make the first contact with the Native Americans. They were chosen to make the first contact because the Spaniards believed that their brown skin, similar to that of the Native Americans, would make them less threatening. And that is exactly what happened. The initial contact between the Luzones Indios and the indigenous Chumash people of what is now Morro Bay was actually pretty peaceful. The Native Americans welcomed the Luzon Indios peacefully. But on the third day, once the Spaniards came ashore, tensions rapidly escalated and violence broke out. And amidst this chaos, 2 people were killed. A javelin struck one of the Luzon Indios in the chest and was immediately killed. Unfortunately, Spanish records only recorded the name of the Spaniard who died, leaving the identity of the fallen Filipino a mystery. Now, this all happened 75 years before the first Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, and almost 200 years before the US Declaration of Independence was signed. So when we talk about the first Filipinos in America, we have to recognize and reflect that our people have been here long before the creation of the United States. But the story of our ancestors in California did not end with the tragic events at Morro Bay, because the Luzones Indios were part of a much bigger, much deeper historical context, the Manila Galleons. This trade route, which lasted from 1565 to 1815, connected the Philippines to Mexico and Spain, and the Manila Galleons transported goods like spices, silk, porcelain, and silver. But they also carried people, thousands of Filipinos, who helped build and sustain the Spanish Empire in the Americas. By the early 1600s, most galleon crews were native Filipinos. These sailors, soldiers, and laborers were instrumental in Spain's colonization of California and other parts of the Americas. In fact, many missions and towns along the coast of California were built with Filipino labor, particularly from the Luzones Indios de la Pampanga. And the contributions of these early Filipinos are often overlooked in American history, yet they played a vital role in shaping these societies. And while we often think of globalization as a modern phenomenon, the Manila Galleon trade was actually one of the earliest examples of a truly global economy, connecting Asia and the Pacific with the Americas and Europe. And early Filipinos were key players in this global system, not just as laborers, but also as cultural intermediaries. The Luzones helped bridge cultures by facilitating communication and exchanges between the Spaniards, the indigenous Americans, and the various migrant Asian communities. Over 3 centuries of this trade laid the groundwork for deeper connections, for deeper cultural exchanges between the Philippines and the Americas. And actually, at one point, Texas was also called Nuevas Filipinas, because the Spaniards sought to replicate their success in the Philippines in this part of the Americas. But more on that in a future video. Now, while the Luzones were central to the early Manila Galleon trade, it is also possible that sailors from the Visayas, who were also known for their rich maritime traditions, might have joined even earlier voyages, although documentation of their involvement is currently limited. But it's a fascinating subject that is worth exploring further as we continue to uncover more layers of our people's shared history. Okay, now let's travel east to the oldest known Asian American settlement in the United States and meet the Manilamen of Louisiana. In the mid-1700s, Filipino sailors known as the Manilamen sought refuge in the marshlands of Louisiana after escaping the harsh conditions of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, and they established St. Malo, located about 5 miles from present-day New Orleans, and thus creating the first permanent and oldest known Asian American community in the United States. Carving out a life in the challenging bayous of Louisiana, the Manilamen are credited with pioneering the modern shrimping industry in the US. Their skills in fishing and shrimping were passed down through generations, contributing to the local economy and culture. But the Manilamen were not just settlers. In fact, they played an important role during the War of 1812, particularly during the Battle of New Orleans from December 1814 to January 1815. The Manilamen were fighting alongside the American forces to defend New Orleans from the British, eventually beating the invaders and thus securing independence for the young country of the United States of America. The Filipino settlement of St. Malo in Louisiana thrived for almost 200 years. Their experiences with tropical typhoons in Southeast Asia prepared the Manilamen in dealing with the raging hurricanes in Louisiana. However, sadly, in 1915, the Filipino village of St. Malo was destroyed by a massive hurricane that swept through New Orleans. But according to their descendants, countless Manilamen stayed behind for many years to come in what remained of their village after the hurricane. And since the 1800s, other settlements similar to St. Malo were also founded by the Manilamen in nearby areas, and this included the bigger settlement known as the Manila Village, and thus strengthening their deep roots in Louisiana, with their descendants still living in the region today. today. Throughout history, the Manilamen of Louisiana intermarried with other ethnicities in the region, such as the neighboring Isleño and Cajun communities. And their unique blend of Filipino, Native American, African, Caribbean, and European traditions continues to enrich Louisiana's cultural landscape. In fact, their multi-ethnic families often blurred and challenged the racial lines imposed by mainstream society, and their colorful contributions to the distinct culture, cuisine, and architecture of the region still persist to the present day. Now, the Manilamen of Louisiana were not the only nor the very first Filipinos who settled in the Americas. In fact, our people have been on this continent for a very long time, across the different parts from California all the way down to Mexico. And while we often think of America as just the United States, we need to remember that it also refers to the entire continents of North and South America, where the presence of Filipinos stretches back even earlier. Interestingly, the presence of early Filipinos in Mexico predates that of the Manilamen in Louisiana by centuries. Unknown to many, a group of early Filipinos were exiled to Mexico as early as 1587. And this was after a failed conspiracy against Spanish colonial rule, known to us today as the Revolt of the or the Tondo Conspiracy. This uprising, led by the Luzones nobility, aka the Lacans and Datus, conspired to form Pan-Asian alliances to reclaim Luzon sovereignty and liberate the Philippines from Spain. But sadly, after the conspiracy was uncovered, many of these noble leaders were exiled to Mexico, and these exiled Datus were among the earliest, if not the very first, recorded people from the Philippines to have settled in what is now Mexico, marking the beginning of centuries of cultural exchange and geopolitical links between the Philippines and Mexico, significantly sustained by the Manila Galleon trade. Over the centuries, this Filipino presence in Mexico bloomed, blending cultures and creating influences that are still seen today. And by the way, next week, we're diving deeper into the thrilling Tondo Conspiracy or Revolt of the Lacans, a powerful story of rebellion and survival, so stay tuned. But let's take a step back and rethink, what do we even mean by Filipino? As mentioned earlier, during the Spanish period, the term Filipino referred to the pure-blooded Spaniards born in the Philippines, not the indigenous people who made up the majority of the population. The natives of the islands were called Indios. And again, it was not until the 1800s that the term Filipino was reclaimed and began to include everyone from the archipelago. So when we talk about the Luzones Indios of Morro Bay, the Manilamen of Louisiana, or the Luzones Datus in Mexico, they would not have identified as Filipino in the way that we understand it today. In fact, they would have identified with their specific ethnic groups, like Kapampangan, Tagalog, Bisaya, Ilocano, and so on. And this evolving identity is part of what makes the history of Filipinos in the Americas so complex yet so fascinating. But if we fast forward to the early 1900s, then we start to see people who identify themselves as Filipino. First, we have the pensionados, young Filipino scholars brought to the US by the American colonial government to study in American universities. And the first wave of pensionados came to the US in 1903, and they were quickly followed by the Manong generation, who first arrived in 1906 as workers in Hawaii, California, and Washington, laying the foundations for the thriving Filipino American communities we see today. In fact, they were the ones who coined the term Pinoy, an identity that millions of Filipinos today proudly embrace globally. Now, long before the modern history of Filipino migration to America, there is also evidence suggesting that our ancestors may have navigated these waters much earlier than we think. Early Austronesians, aka the ancestors of modern-day Filipinos, Pacific Islanders, and other Southeast Asians, could have ventured further into the Americas. And although these theories are still being researched and debated, they offer us fascinating and intriguing insights into the early seafaring capabilities of our ancestors and their possible connections across the Pacific. So who exactly were the first Filipinos in America? Now, the answer to this question, it's complicated. It depends on how we define, both Filipino and America. But one thing is clear, our people have been part of the story of the Americas for a very long time, for at least 400 years. From the Luzones Indios in the 1500s to the Manilamen in the 1700s and the Manongs of the early 1900s, Filipinos have left a lasting legacy across the Americas. But as we reflect on this deep history, we must also acknowledge the indigenous peoples of these lands. The Native Americans had long established their cultures and societies long before any of these encounters took place. In fact, the arrival of the Luzones Indios at Morro Bay is just one moment in a much larger story, one that includes the complex interactions between indigenous peoples and those arriving from distant shores. And as we continue to explore these histories, it is important for us to remember that the land we discuss has always been home to Native Americans, and their stories are just as vital in shaping the narrative of the Americas. And just like the Luzones Indios who bridged cultures and broke racial barriers, we have the opportunity to continue building solidarity across our communities by uplifting each other and learning from our shared histories. We can break through the divisions of the past and foster a future where every story is recognized and celebrated. And just like our Manongs and the Manilamen, let us strengthen our solidarity by amplifying these voices and ensuring that our collective stories of resilience, survival, and hope continue to inspire and empower future generations. If you've enjoyed this video and learned something new, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming videos about our people's history, culture, and everything in between. And one last thing before I go, I just want to say salamat, a heartfelt thank you to all of you, my subscribers, patrons, and viewers like you throughout these years. Your support has kept this channel going for over 12 years, and I'm truly grateful, sincerely grateful for our growing community. And if you are new here, I'd love for you to join our growing community. You can support my research and my channel by becoming a member on YouTube or a patron on Patreon, and I've actually just updated the perks for you to enjoy. Plus, if you're interested, you can also grab copies of any of my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch, all about the colorful history and fascinating cultures of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Check out the links below for more information. Maraming salamat po, or in Kamampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan and in Ilocano, agyaman aklaunay. See you next time, in Tagalog kita kits and in Kamampangan, Mikitix and in Binisaya, kita aita.